Stephanie did not return the way people expected her to return. There was no slow reveal, no trembling embrace at the doorway, no soft tears falling onto familiar shoulders, as if time itself had folded backward to grant absolution. She arrived like a verdict. The holiday decorations were still up, the remnants of forced cheer clinging to the walls of the Forrester estate, when she walked into the room carrying nothing but a slim leather folder under her arm and an expression that left no room for sentiment. The conversation died the moment she crossed the threshold, not because she demanded attention, but because her presence carried its own gravity, the kind forged through decades of authority that had never needed to announce itself. Ridge stood first, instinctively, the reflex of a son who had spent his life oscillating between rebellion and obedience. He expected questions, accusations, perhaps even relief disguised as anger. What he did not expect was the sound of paper striking glass. Stephanie placed the folder on the table with deliberate force, the impact sharp enough to cut through the stunned silence, and only then did she look at him. There was no warmth in her gaze, no maternal indulgence. There was assessment. She told them to open it. Inside lay a living trust, meticulously drafted, notarized, and dated years earlier, from a period most of them preferred to remember as settled history. The language was precise, clinical, and devastating in its implications. It outlined a contingency no one in the room had known existed, or perhaps had chosen to forget, that if Forrester Creations were ever diverted from its founding purpose, if its voting power was seized or distorted by outside influence, or if leadership compromised the company's integrity, control would automatically revert, not to Ridge, not to Brooke, not to any board, but to Stephanie herself. The room shifted as understanding took hold. This was not an emotional maneuver. This was architecture. Stephanie had anticipated fracture long before it became visible, had embedded her authority not in day-to-day management, but in the bones of the institution itself. The trust did not accuse anyone directly, it did not need to. Its existence was accusation enough. Ridge reacted first with disbelief, then indignation. He argued that he had been running the company, that he had borne the responsibility, that every decision he made had been for Forrester's survival. Stephanie listened without interruption, her face unreadable, her silence more punishing than any rebuke. When he finished, she spoke with a calm that stripped his words of their urgency. She told him that survival without direction was not leadership, that continuity without conscience was not legacy. She reminded him that Forrester Creations had never been meant to be a throne inherited by proximity, but a stewardship earned through alignment with its founding values. Then she delivered the sentence that fractured whatever certainty Ridge had left. She said that he was not the center of the company. He was holding the chair. Nothing more. The words landed with surgical precision. Ridge felt the ground tilt beneath him, not because he had been stripped of power outright, but because the narrative he had built his identity around had just been dismantled. He had believed himself indispensable, the axis around which everything turned. Stephanie's declaration reframed his entire tenure as provisional, conditional, and revocable. The shock had not yet fully settled when she turned her attention to Steffi. Steffi had been silent since Stephanie's arrival, watching closely, absorbing every shift in tone, every implication buried beneath legal language. When Stephanie said her name, Steffi felt the weight of generations press down on her shoulders. Stephanie announced, without ceremony, that Steffi had been named executor of the trust. Not as a symbolic gesture, not as a reward, but as a safeguard. Steffi was to be the one who ensured the trust's conditions were enforced, the one who determined whether the company had crossed the line Stephanie had drawn long ago. The room erupted then, not in noise, but in fracture. Ridge stared at Steffi as if seeing her for the first time, betrayal flashing across his face with painful clarity. This was not just a loss of authority, it was a loss of intimacy, of assumed allegiance. In his mind, Leadership had always flowed downward through him. Stephanie's choice rerouted that flow entirely, bypassing him, placing trust where he had never expected it to land. Steffi did not react immediately. She did not smile, did not defend herself, did not rush to justify the decision. She understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the room, what Stephanie had done. This was not favoritism. It was a test. A burden disguised as empowerment. By naming Steffi executor, Stephanie had positioned her between generations, forcing her to become arbiter not just of corporate direction, but of family truth. Ridge accused Stephanie of undermining him, of humiliating him in his own home. Stephanie responded without raising her voice. She told him that humiliation was not inflicted, it was revealed. She reminded him of the compromises he had normalized, the lines he had blurred in the name of control. She spoke not as a mother scolding a child, but as a founder correcting a deviation. For the first time, Ridge understood that Stephanie's return was not about reconciliation. It was about reclamation. Brooke attempted to intervene, to soften the confrontation, but Stephanie stopped her with a look alone. She acknowledged Brooke's role in keeping the company afloat, but made it clear that influence without accountability was precisely what the trust had been designed to prevent. This was not personal, she insisted. It was structural. As the implications settled, alliances shifted in real time. Steffi felt eyes turn toward her, some hopeful, some resentful, some calculating. She realized that from this moment forward, every decision she made would be interpreted not as judgment, but as intention. The trust gave her authority, but it also stripped away plausible deniability. She could no longer claim neutrality. Ridge, meanwhile, felt something inside him fracture beyond repair. The betrayal he perceived was not just from Stephanie, but from the system he thought he embodied. He had spent years fighting external threats, believing the danger came from rivals and outsiders. He had not considered that the most decisive blow would come from within, codified years ago by the very person who taught him what leadership meant. Stephanie gathered the papers back into the folder, signaling that the discussion was not over, merely paused. She told them all that the company was at a crossroads, that the trust existed not to punish, but to correct. She made it clear that she would not interfere unless necessary, but that necessity was no longer hypothetical. She left the room as she had entered it, without apology, without reassurance, leaving behind a silence heavier than any argument. After she was gone, no one spoke for a long moment. The Forrester legacy had been redefined in the span of minutes, not through emotion or force, but through foresight. Steffi finally exhaled, understanding that whatever came next would demand more than loyalty. It would demand courage to act when action meant choosing between blood and principle. Ridge remained standing, staring at the space Stephanie had occupied, grappling with a truth he had never prepared himself to face: that power inherited without reflection was never truly owned. And that in the end, the legacy he believed was his to command had always belonged to someone who knew exactly when to take it back. Stephanie did not return out of nostalgia, nor did she return because she missed the familiar weight of power. She returned because patterns, once seen, could not be unseen, and what she had uncovered was not a single mistake or a reckless decision, but a carefully woven architecture of control. It began quietly, as most dangerous things did, with a discrepancy so small it could have been dismissed as administrative noise. A signature here that appeared earlier than expected. A contract there that carried language just ambiguous enough to pass scrutiny while bending intent. On their own, each document looked legitimate, even prudent. Together, they told a story that chilled her more than any open act of betrayal ever could. Stephanie had spent her life understanding systems, how power flowed, how ownership shifted, how people learned to hide ambition behind procedure. What she saw now was not chaos, but design. Ridge's authority had not simply continued through time, it had been reinforced, subtly and repeatedly, through ownership adjustments, extensions of voting rights, internal restructurings framed as modernization. Each move had been justified, approved, normalized. And yet, when Stephanie traced the chain backward, she realized the result was undeniable. Ridge had effectively secured long-term dominance over Forrester creations in a way that went far beyond stewardship. It was consolidation disguised as continuity. The betrayal was not that Ridge wanted power. She had expected that. The betrayal was that the mechanisms had been manipulated so elegantly that no one questioned them. Until she did. Her return was not dramatic by accident, it was deliberate by necessity. Eric's declining health cast a long shadow over everything, and Stephanie understood that legacy was most vulnerable when its founder could no longer intervene. She did not come back to reclaim a title or relive old battles. She came back because the house she built was on the brink of being hollowed out from the inside, not by enemies, but by family turning governance into inheritance without accountability. Stephanie confronted Ridge not with emotion, but with evidence. She laid out the sequence of contracts, amendments, and internal approvals with surgical clarity. She showed him how authority had been quietly extended, how safeguards had been diluted, how checks that once required consensus now bent automatically in his favor. Ridge protested at first, insisting everything had been legal, approved, necessary. Stephanie did not argue that point. Instead, she corrected him. Legality, she reminded him, was not morality, and compliance was not consent. Then she delivered the ultimatum. If Ridge did not voluntarily relinquish managerial control and submit to oversight, Stephanie would activate the internal investigation clause embedded deep within the company's governance framework. The clause most people had forgotten existed. It would trigger a full audit, forensic accounting, retroactive review of ownership changes, and regulatory scrutiny that would not remain internal for long. The media would feast on it. Shareholders would panic. Partners would hesitate. Forrester's stock would bleed. The company would survive, perhaps, but its myth of stability would not. This was not a threat made lightly. It was a calculated willingness to burn down illusions to save the structure beneath. The most devastating revelation came last. Stephanie revealed that Ridge had not acted alone. The documents pointed not to an outside consultant or rival strategist, but to a familiar hand, someone trusted, embedded within the family, whose name carried emotional weight. The room shifted when that truth surfaced. This was not an external coup. It was an internal accommodation, a quiet alliance formed under the guise of support, loyalty, or love. Someone had helped Ridge refine the language, smooth the process, anticipate objections. Someone who believed they were protecting him, perhaps even protecting the company, without realizing they were undermining its soul. Stephanie did not name the person publicly, not yet. But the implication was enough to fracture certainty across the room. Eyes darted. Old conversations were reinterpreted. Innocent reassurances now felt suspect. Eric's health became the fulcrum upon which everything turned. Stephanie spoke of him not as a victim, but as a legacy under threat. She accused Ridge of allowing emotion, marriages, alliances, personal loyalties, to steer corporate decisions that should have been insulated from such volatility. Ridge bristled at the accusation, insisting that empathy and connection were not weaknesses. Stephanie countered with cold clarity. Leadership driven by emotion without restraint was indistinguishable from recklessness when the stakes were generational. Forrester Creations, she said, did not need another king. It needed a custodian with iron discipline. Her solution was swift and uncompromising. She convened an emergency council, invoking authority she had never fully surrendered. Its mandate was narrow, but absolute: preserve Eric's legacy by stabilizing governance. As its first act, the council suspended Ridge's signing authority for 30 days. No contracts, no binding decisions, no unilateral actions. A pause, she called it. A quarantine. Ridge reacted not with submission, but with counterattack. Within hours, his version of events reached the public sphere. He framed Stephanie's return as opportunistic, her actions as a hostile takeover disguised as maternal concern. He accused her of exploiting Eric's illness to justify an internal coup, painting himself as the rightful steward being undermined by an out-of-touch founder unwilling to let go. The narrative spread quickly, amplified by headlines hungry for drama and conflict. Social media fractured into camps. Commentators debated whether Stephanie was a guardian of legacy, or an autocrat refusing evolution. True to the nature of the bold and the beautiful world, public opinion hardened fast. Some rallied behind Stephanie, praising her for stepping in when emotional leadership threatened institutional collapse. Others sided with Ridge, seeing him as a modernizer unfairly punished by old power clinging desperately to relevance. The company's name dominated the news cycle, not for design or innovation, but for internal war. Inside Forrester, the atmosphere turned brittle. Meetings became cautious. Conversations ended abruptly when unfamiliar ears approached. Trust eroded not through argument, but through silence. Employees wondered which signatures still mattered, which directives would be reversed, and whether their own futures were collateral damage in a family reckoning decades in the making. Stephanie remained unmoved by the noise. She understood that legitimacy was not won in headlines, but in outcomes. She had not returned to be liked. She had returned to end something before it consumed everything Eric had built. As Ridge watched the company, he believed he led slip into uncertainty. Anger gave way to something more dangerous: doubt. He began to question not just Stephanie's motives, but his own path. Had he protected Forrester, or had he shaped it into a reflection of his unresolved needs? The answer unsettled him, because it was no longer clear. And hovering over it all was the unanswered question Stephanie had placed at the center of the storm: who, exactly, had helped Ridge bend the system and why? As the 30-day suspension began, Forrester Creations stood at a crossroads. One road led toward ruthless clarity, the other toward emotional allegiance. Stephanie had drawn the line. Ridge had challenged it. The public had chosen sides. And Eric's legacy, fragile, monumental, and unfinished, waited to see which version of family would claim it first.